It was a bright Sunday morning in the small town of Oakwood, located just outside of Chicago. The church bell tolled at 10 a.m., signaling the start of another service. Inside, a congregation of devout individuals was already settling into their pews, their faces peaceful, ready to hear the word of God. The church was a modest building with a small but faithful community who looked up to their pastor, Reverend Harold Bennett, as a guiding figure. This particular Sunday was meant to be a special one. The church had been planning a grand celebration for the upcoming anniversary of the pastor's ministry. The air was filled with excitement, and the church was decorated with fresh flowers. The children ran about the church, eager to participate in the service, while the adults exchanged pleasantries and smiles. But something dark was brewing behind the scenes. Among the congregation that day was Deacon Thomas Walker, a long-standing member of the church with a reputation for being quiet, serious, and deeply involved in the church's work. He sat in the front row, his hands tightly gripping the edge of his seat, as if something was weighing heavily on his mind. As the service began, the pastor stood at the pulpit, his voice reverberating through the room. "Brothers and sisters," Reverend Bennett began, "let us bow our heads and give thanks for another beautiful day." His words were met with a chorus of "Amen" and soft murmurs of agreement. But Deacon Walker, who had been listening intently, seemed distracted. His eyes were fixed on one person in particular, the pastor's wife, Evelyn Bennett, who sat beside her husband, radiating grace and warmth. Evelyn had always been the epitome of charm and elegance. She was a woman whose beauty went beyond her appearance, with a kind smile and a heart that seemed to care for everyone. But beneath that outward beauty, there was a secret, one that was tearing Deacon Walker apart. As Reverend Bennett continued with his sermon, Deacon Walker's expression darkened. His fists clenched, and his heart raced with a mixture of anger, betrayal, and hurt. He had learned the truth about Evelyn's secret, a truth that no one in the church knew. Evelyn had infected him with HIV. The disease that he had contracted months ago had now taken hold of his body, and he could feel the symptoms worsening every day. And the person responsible was sitting right in front of him, smiling, laughing, and acting as though nothing was wrong. It was a betrayal that went beyond what Deacon Walker could bear. He had trusted Evelyn. She had been his friend, his confidant. He had helped her with church activities, supported her in times of trouble, and stood by her side. And in return, she had destroyed him, ruined his life without a second thought. He had caught the disease from her during a moment of weakness, a brief affair that she had promised was nothing more than a mistake. But now, as the virus took its toll on his body, he realized it was no mistake at all. As the service drew to a close, a strange tension hung in the air. The congregation was unaware of the storm brewing in the heart of their deacon. Reverend Bennett finished his sermon with a powerful prayer, and the congregation stood to sing a hymn. But Deacon Walker, filled with rage, knew that there was only one thing left for him to do. He slowly rose from his seat and made his way to the altar. His footsteps echoed through the church, unnoticed by the others, until he reached the front. The pastor, who had been standing with his back to him, turned around, a warm smile on his face. "Deacon Walker," Reverend Bennett said, extending a hand, "is there something you need?" But Deacon Walker didn't shake his hand. Instead, he pulled out a gun from his coat pocket, a weapon he had kept hidden for days, waiting for the right moment. Without a word, he raised the gun and aimed it directly at Evelyn, who was sitting beside her husband, unsuspecting. The church gasped as Deacon Walker fired a single shot. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the walls, and Evelyn Bennett slumped forward, lifeless, blood spreading across the white cloth of the altar. Reverend Bennett screamed in shock, rushing to his wife's side, but it was too late. She was already gone. Chaos erupted in the church. Screams filled the air as the congregation scrambled to escape the scene. Some ran toward the exit, others crouched behind pews trying to find cover. But Deacon Walker stood there, frozen, his eyes wide with madness, as he watched the life drain from Evelyn's body. In the midst of the chaos, he lowered the gun, his anger still burning, but now replaced by a strange sense of relief. He had done it. He had finally avenged the pain she had caused him. The virus was no longer something he had to suffer with alone, and in that moment, he felt an overwhelming sense of justice, though it was tragic and violent. As police sirens wailed in the distance, Deacon Walker calmly turned and walked out of the church, leaving behind a scene of horror and confusion. But one thing was certain: this crime was not going to be easily explained. The investigation into Evelyn Bennett's death would uncover secrets that no one in Oakwood could have ever imagined. And as the investigation unfolded, the shocking truth would begin to emerge. The bright morning that had begun so peacefully for the small town of Oakwood quickly turned to chaos. The sound of sirens filled the air as police vehicles pulled up to the church, their red and blue lights flashing violently against the stained glass windows. Officers rushed inside, their boots heavy against the wooden floor, while paramedics followed closely behind, quickly assessing the scene. Reverend Harold Bennett was still kneeling at his wife's side when the first officer entered the church. His hands were shaking and tears streamed down his face as he tried to hold her, to wake her up, but it was no use. Evelyn was gone. He hadn't even had time to fully process what had happened, and now his world was crashing down around him. The officers began to secure the scene, cordoning off the area and pushing the terrified congregation outside. The church was in disarray. Purses and Bibles were scattered on the pews, the hymnals overturned, and the altar was stained with Evelyn's blood. The congregation stood outside, shivering in the cold, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. Some whispered in hushed tones, others simply stared at the church in shock. No one could believe that something so horrific could have happened in their peaceful, quiet town. Detective Rachel Hayes arrived at the scene around noon. A seasoned investigator with over 15 years on the force, Rachel was known for her calm demeanor and sharp mind. She had worked on her fair share of homicide cases, but nothing like this. The violent murder in the church was like nothing she had ever seen before. A deacon killing the pastor's wife in front of the congregation? There had to be more to this story. The church was already a crime scene by the time Rachel stepped inside. She took a long look around, her eyes scanning the area with precision. She was methodical, accustomed to taking in every detail. The body of Evelyn Bennett still lay on the altar, and Rachel could see that the scene was unsettlingly clean, apart from the blood. It was almost as if the shooter had known exactly what he was doing. Detective Hayes, a uniformed officer, greeted her as she approached the front. "We've secured the scene. There are no other victims at this time." Rachel nodded. "Good. What's the story?" The officer handed her a sheet of paper detailing the initial report. According to witnesses, Deacon Thomas Walker was the shooter. After the shot was fired, he walked calmly out of the church, leaving the congregation in chaos. He didn't say a word. They say he appeared calm, almost too calm, as he left the scene. Rachel frowned as she looked at the report. And the pastor? He was in a state of shock, obviously. He didn't see it coming, but he tried to save his wife immediately after she was shot. He's being interviewed now. Rachel raised an eyebrow. So we have a deacon shooting the pastor's wife in front of the congregation, no apparent motive, and the pastor doesn't know why. Great. Let's get a list of witnesses. As she walked toward the back of the church, she passed Reverend Bennett, who was sitting in the corner, head bowed in his hands. His grief was palpable, but Rachel knew better than to let emotions cloud her judgment. She had to stay focused on the case. Reverend Bennett? Rachel approached him cautiously, not wanting to overwhelm him. "I'm Detective Hayes. I know this is a difficult time, but I need to ask you a few questions." The pastor looked up, his eyes swollen from tears. His voice was shaky as he spoke. I can't believe it. Thomas did this. Why would he?" "I'm not sure, Reverend," Rachel said gently, her voice calm and steady. "But I need you to answer some questions. Do you know if there was any conflict between you, your wife, and Deacon Walker?" Reverend Bennett shook his head, his face clouded with confusion. No, nothing like that. Thomas is a good man, a loyal deacon. He's been with us for years." "I don't understand. Why would he do this?" Rachel could sense the genuine bewilderment in the pastor's voice, but she also knew that appearances could be deceiving. She made a mental note to look into Deacon Walker's background more thoroughly. There had to be something that could explain this tragedy. Can you think of any reason why he would target your wife? Rachel pressed. The pastor seemed to hesitate, his eyes flickering to the floor as if deep in thought. No, I don't think so. Evelyn was beloved by everyone. She was kind, charitable. I don't understand, Rachel nodded. All right, I'm sorry for your loss, Reverend. We'll do everything we can to get to the bottom of this. After finishing her conversation with Reverend Bennett, Rachel moved on to the next task, speaking with the witnesses. Most of the churchgoers had been ushered outside, but a few were still waiting to provide statements. Among the witnesses was Sarah Miller, a young woman who had been sitting near the front of the church when the shooting occurred. She appeared nervous, but eager to help. Detective Hayes, Sarah said, her voice trembling. It all happened so fast. One moment, everything was normal. The next, Deacon Walker. He just stood up and, take a breath, Rachel said gently. Just tell me what you saw. Sarah nodded, her hands fidgeting in her lap. I saw him stand up. He had this look on his face, like he was determined. Then he pulled out a gun from his coat and shot Mrs. Bennett. It was like he knew exactly what he was doing. Rachel's eyes narrowed as she listened. Did he say anything? No, Sarah shook her head. He didn't say anything. He just fired the shot and then walked out like nothing happened. Rachel frowned. This didn't seem like a spur-of-the-moment decision. Deacon Walker's actions were deliberate. But what would drive a man to commit such an act in front of a church full of people? Was there something more going on behind the scenes? Rachel's mind raced as she processed the information. She was beginning to get the sense that this murder was not as simple as it appeared on the surface. There was a deeper, darker story waiting to be uncovered. All right, Rachel said, standing up. Thank you for your statement, Sarah. I'll need to speak with everyone who was close to the altar. I'll also need access to any personal records on Deacon Walker. As Sarah was escorted away, Rachel took one last look at the crime scene. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but there were still too many questions left unanswered. Why had Deacon Walker killed Evelyn Bennett? What had driven him to such a violent act? And most importantly, was there something more sinister lurking in the background of this otherwise peaceful church? Detective Rachel Hayes spent the following days digging into the lives of the people involved in the shocking murder. Every detail, every conversation, every document had the potential to unravel the mystery. The investigation was heating up, and Rachel was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how deep the secrets ran. The first step in the investigation was to track down Deacon Thomas Walker. It wasn't long before they found him. After the murder, he had been apprehended just outside the church, barely a block away. He hadn't resisted arrest, hadn't spoken a word, and had appeared calm, too calm for someone who had just committed such a violent act. Deacon Walker was brought to the Oakwood police station, where he sat silently in an interrogation room, his hands folded in front of him. He didn't look at Rachel as she entered, his eyes fixed on the table. His face was tired, his clothes rumpled, but his demeanor remained eerily composed. Deacon Walker, Rachel said, sitting across from him. You know why you're here, don't you? Walker nodded but didn't speak. His silence was suffocating. Rachel leaned forward. You shot Evelyn Bennett in front of dozens of witnesses, and yet you haven't said a word. Why? What was going through your mind? Walker looked at her now, his eyes empty, and for a brief moment, Rachel could see a flicker of something dark behind them, but it vanished quickly, leaving only a cold expression in its place. I didn't mean to, he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. I had no choice. Rachel's instincts told her there was more to the story. She had seen this kind of blankness before, when a person was hiding something, or when they couldn't bear to confront the truth. She needed him to open up. You didn't mean to, she echoed. Then why did you pull the trigger? For the first time since she entered the room, Deacon Walker shifted uncomfortably. He lowered his gaze, staring at his hands, his fingers twisting nervously around each other. I had to, he said quietly, almost as though he was talking to himself. She infected me. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. Infected? The word hung in the air like a heavy cloud. She had expected many things, but not this. Who? She asked, her voice more gentle now, trying to get him to explain. Who did you mean? Walker's eyes flicked up to meet hers. A slight spark of something, anger, pain, flickered behind his gaze. Evelyn, he muttered, his voice breaking. She gave me the virus. She gave me HIV. The words hit Rachel like a punch to the gut. HIV. She had never anticipated this twist. For a moment, Rachel was silent, allowing the gravity of the revelation to settle in. But she couldn't let herself get distracted by her own thoughts. She needed the facts. Evelyn Bennett gave you HIV? Rachel repeated. When? How do you know this? Walker nodded slowly, as if each word cost him something. A few months ago, we had an affair. He winced as he said it, as though the mere memory of it was physically painful. It was a mistake. I didn't think she would do this to me, but she did. She never told me she was sick. She never told me anything about it. I found out when I started getting sick. I went to the doctor, and that's when I learned the truth. Rachel took a deep breath, her mind racing. An affair, HIV. The pastor's wife, Evelyn, had been hiding such a dangerous secret from her own husband, from the entire church, while putting so many lives at risk. This was no ordinary affair. It was a ticking time bomb. Did you tell Reverend Bennett? Rachel asked, her voice soft but firm. Walker shook his head, his face now contorted in guilt. I didn't know how. I couldn't. I couldn't hurt him like that. He's a good man. He's been there for me for years. I didn't know what to do. Rachel was silent for a moment, absorbing everything he was telling her. This was a new dimension to the case, one she hadn't anticipated. Deacon Walker wasn't just angry, he felt betrayed on a deep personal level. His confession made sense in a way, but there was still so much Rachel didn't understand. Why kill Evelyn? She asked. Why shoot her in front of everyone? Walker's expression tightened, as though the pain of that moment was still too raw to face. Because I couldn't take it anymore. She lied to me. She knew what she had, and she didn't tell me. She ruined my life. I'm sick. I'm going to die, and it's all because of her. I couldn't stand it anymore. I couldn't live with the shame, and I couldn't let her go on with her life, pretending everything was okay. Rachel leaned back, her mind working at full speed. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Walker was consumed by anger, yes, but there was also a deep sense of betrayal and pain. He had been infected, his life changed forever, and it was all Evelyn's fault in his eyes. But it didn't justify murder. No matter how much pain he had suffered, killing her wasn't the answer. Deacon Walker, Rachel said, her voice steady, I need you to tell me everything. Was this the first time you two had been involved? Were there others who knew about the affair? Walker didn't respond immediately. He seemed lost in thought, his mind trapped in the turmoil of the past few months. But then he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. There were others, he admitted, his tone heavy with regret. We were careless. There were moments when we thought we could get away with it, but it didn't matter in the end. The truth always comes out. She never wanted to get caught. But it wasn't just the affair. It was everything she did after. She continued to lie to me and to everyone else. She didn't care about me. She didn't care about anyone. Rachel's heart sank. This was a much darker story than she had first imagined. Not only had Evelyn betrayed her husband, but she had been hiding a deadly secret for months. She had exposed not just Walker, but potentially others in the congregation, to a disease that could ruin lives. But Walker's actions still didn't make sense. Murder was never the answer, no matter how betrayed he felt. Rachel gave Walker one last look before standing up. I'm going to need time to process all of this, she said, but you need to understand that killing her, shooting her in front of the whole church, won't bring you peace. It will only make everything worse. Walker didn't respond. He just stared at her, his face a mask of resignation. As Rachel walked out of the interrogation room, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the case bearing down on her. Evelyn Bennett's affair, her secret, the HIV infection, it all led to this moment. But there was still so much she didn't know. Who else had been affected by Evelyn's actions? Was there anyone else in the church who might have been exposed? And why had Evelyn done it? Was it all just a momentary lapse in judgment, or was there something more sinister at play? Rachel had only scratched the surface. Detective Rachel Hayes spent the following week piecing together the complex puzzle that was unraveling in Oakwood. The more she dug into the life of Evelyn Bennett, the more she realized how carefully constructed her life had been. The perfect image of a pastor's wife, graceful, charitable, deeply involved in her community, hid a much darker truth, one that, if uncovered, could destroy the lives of many. The investigation was rapidly expanding. Rachel knew she needed to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Deacon Thomas Walker's confession about his affair with Evelyn had thrown a wrench into the case, but it also opened the door to a deeper inquiry into Evelyn's relationships and activities. The first lead Rachel decided to follow was the church's financial records. From her experience, financial stress and personal secrets often went hand in hand, especially when it came to people with access to funds. She needed to know if there was anything unusual in the church's books that might suggest Evelyn had been hiding something else, something more than just an affair. She met with Carol Thompson, the church's bookkeeper, who was a middle-aged woman with a sharp eye for detail and a long history at the church. Carol seemed a bit wary when she saw Rachel enter her office. It wasn't unusual. Everyone in Oakwood knew about the murder by now, and most of the townsfolk had their own opinions. But Rachel wasn't there to gossip. She was there to find answers. "Miss Thompson, thank you for meeting with me," Rachel began. "I know this is a difficult time, but I need to ask you about the church's financials. Was there anything unusual in the records over the past year?" Carol's eyes flickered nervously, and she glanced at the piles of paperwork on her desk. She took a deep breath, as though gathering her thoughts. "I don't know what you mean by unusual. Everything's been in order for the most part. We've had our regular donations, and Evelyn was always active in charity drives. She was an important part of the community outreach programs." Rachel nodded, but her instincts told her there was more. "And what about Evelyn's personal finances? Were there any large sums of money coming in or out that seemed out of place?" Carol hesitated, her fingers tapping against the edge of the desk. "Well, there was one thing. It wasn't huge, but it was odd. A couple of months ago, Evelyn received a large deposit, $10,000, from an account we couldn't trace. It came in around the same time that Deacon Walker started complaining about feeling sick." Rachel's eyes widened. This was new information. "What kind of deposit?" Carol shrugged. "I don't know. We thought maybe it was a donation from one of her personal friends, but there wasn't any accompanying paperwork. We looked into it at the time, but we couldn't trace it. It didn't seem like a legitimate church donation, but Evelyn never mentioned it. I assumed it was a personal matter, so I didn't press her on it." Rachel's mind began to race. Evelyn had been keeping secrets, and the sudden appearance of $10,000 raised more questions than it answered. It could very well be connected to the affair, or it could be something else entirely. Either way, it needed to be investigated. She thanked Carol and told her she would need full access to the financial records in order to move forward. As Rachel left the bookkeeper's office, her phone buzzed. It was Officer Jameson, one of the officers assigned to the case. "Detective," he said, his voice low and serious, "we've dug into the background of Deacon Walker, and there's something you need to see." Rachel felt a shiver run down her spine. "What is it?" Jameson didn't answer directly. "We found something in his past. I think it's important. You might want to come by the station." When Rachel arrived at the Oakwood police station, Officer Jameson handed her a file. The contents were startling. Deacon Walker, who had presented himself as a humble, devout man, had a criminal record, albeit a small one. Several years ago, he had been involved in an altercation at a bar in Chicago. The charge had been for assault after an argument with another man escalated into violence. The report showed that Walker had been drinking heavily that night, and though the charges were later dropped, the incident raised questions about his emotional stability. But that wasn't all. As Rachel flipped through the file, she found something more disturbing. Deacon Walker had been previously diagnosed with a mental health disorder. A diagnosis of severe depression and anger management issues had been noted in his medical records, along with a recommendation for therapy. It appeared that Deacon Walker's struggle with his emotions had not been a recent development. It had been building for years. This revelation painted a much darker picture of the man. Could his depression and anger issues have contributed to his violent outburst? And had Evelyn, knowing about his mental state, used it to her advantage? The more Rachel thought about it, the more questions piled up. Later that evening, Rachel took a trip to the local hospital to dig deeper into Deacon Walker's medical history. She knew it wasn't just the church that could hold secrets. Doctors, too, had access to private information that could be crucial to understanding a person's behavior. After talking to a few contacts, Rachel was able to get access to Walker's medical records. What she found shocked her. Deacon Walker had been diagnosed with HIV a few months before the murder. The doctor's notes indicated that Walker had come in with symptoms of the disease, though he had initially been reluctant to test. When the results came back, it was confirmed, HIV positive. But what was more surprising was the doctor's comment about Walker's mental state. His emotional response to the diagnosis was described as extreme, and he had expressed thoughts of self-harm and violence toward others. Rachel had seen this before. The combination of depression, anger, and a devastating diagnosis was often a recipe for disaster. But there was still something that didn't add up. Why would Evelyn keep this information from him? Why wouldn't she tell him about her condition? Rachel's next step was to investigate Evelyn's personal life further. She needed to understand why she had kept her HIV status a secret from Deacon Walker and, more importantly, from her husband, Reverend Bennett. It was time to dig into her medical history, and with the help of her connections, Rachel managed to acquire Evelyn's medical records. As she sifted through them, something caught her attention. Evelyn had been diagnosed with HIV several years prior, long before her affair with Deacon Walker. She had been living with the disease in secret, keeping it hidden from everyone, including her husband. In the doctor's notes, it was clear that Evelyn had been struggling with depression too. Though she had never sought treatment, she had been living a double life, one that seemed perfect on the outside. But inside, she was fighting a losing battle against both the disease and her own mental health. The affair with Deacon Walker had not been a random mistake. It had been part of Evelyn's attempt to escape from her own pain. But in the process, she had caused untold harm to everyone around her. Walker, her husband, and potentially others in the church. Rachel leaned back in her chair, the weight of the case pressing down on her. She had uncovered a twisted web of lies, betrayal, and deep personal suffering. Evelyn had kept her HIV status a secret from everyone, and now it had cost her life. Deacon Walker's anger and desperation had led him to murder, and in the process, he had revealed the ugly truth of his own mental illness. The more Rachel thought about it, the more she realized that the story wasn't just about one murder. It was about the ripple effect of secrets and lies. And it wasn't over yet. There were still more questions to answer, more people to talk to. But Rachel knew one thing for sure. The truth was always harder to face than any of the lies. The town of Oakwood was still reeling from the events at the church. For days, whispers had filled the streets, and the community was left to grapple with the aftermath. Pastor Harold Bennett, his grief buried beneath a heavy weight of confusion, had yet to fully process the loss of his wife. His faith, once a steady rock, was now shaken to its core, and every conversation about the case seemed to lead to more questions than answers. Detective Rachel Hayes, however, was focused on the task at hand. She had already spent days combing through Evelyn Bennett's personal and medical records, and she'd started to piece together a timeline. But there were still some gaps, pieces that didn't quite fit into the story she had been building. One of those pieces was the $10,000 deposit that had mysteriously appeared in Evelyn's bank account, which Carol Thompson, the church bookkeeper, had mentioned. That money, which had arrived shortly before the affair with Deacon Walker became public, continued to puzzle Rachel. Was it a secret donation, a personal loan, or was it something much more sinister? To uncover the truth, Rachel decided it was time to take a closer look at the source of the deposit. After all, it was odd that someone would donate such a large amount of money with no paper trail, especially since Evelyn had been an upstanding member of the community. Rachel's first thought was to check the records of the bank that had processed the deposit, and after a series of phone calls, she managed to get a hold of the bank manager, who was more than willing to cooperate. The investigation hit a breakthrough when the bank revealed that the source of the $10,000 deposit was a private account in the name of someone Rachel didn't recognize, Victor Harris. This name didn't ring any bells. Rachel scribbled it down in her notebook. She needed to know who this person was and why he had sent such a large sum of money to Evelyn Bennett. The next day, Rachel met with Officer Jameson and a few other members of her team. They had compiled everything they could find on Victor Harris. As it turned out, Harris had a criminal history. He was known for a string of shady business deals and had been involved in various unsavory activities, including running a small-time gambling ring. Harris was someone who didn't fit in with the picture of a peaceful religious community like Oakwood. And yet there he was, somehow linked to Evelyn Bennett. Rachel wasn't one to make assumptions, but it seemed too coincidental to ignore. She needed to learn more about how Victor Harris was connected to Evelyn, and most importantly, how he fit into the overall picture of the murder. The next step was to track him down. Jameson's team worked tirelessly to locate Harris, eventually finding out that he had moved to a neighboring town just a week before the shooting. They wasted no time. The following morning, Rachel and a small team made the trip to the nearby town of Harpersville. They arrived at a nondescript house on the outskirts of Harpersville. The house was run down, with peeling paint and overgrown weeds in the front yard. Rachel knocked on the door, but there was no answer. She turned to Jameson, who motioned for a quick search of the property. After a few minutes of checking, Jameson found a back door that had been left ajar. They pushed inside cautiously, moving through the dimly lit house. The place was cluttered, with old furniture, newspapers stacked in corners, and an unmistakable stench of neglect hanging in the air. It didn't take long to find Victor Harris. He was sitting on a sofa, his eyes wide with fear when he saw the officers enter. "Mr. Harris," Rachel said, keeping her voice calm and controlled. "We need to talk to you about the $10,000 deposit you made to Evelyn Bennett's account. Do you know her?" Victor Harris looked terrified. He was a middle-aged man, scruffy and unkempt, wearing an old flannel shirt. He fidgeted nervously as Rachel's question sank in. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, his voice shaking. "Don't lie, Mr. Harris," Rachel said sharply. "We have the records. You made the deposit, and we know it came from your account." Harris swallowed hard. He seemed to be trying to make sense of the situation. "Okay," he said finally, his voice quieter. "I know Evelyn, but she asked me to send the money. She told me she was in trouble." Rachel's brows furrowed. "What kind of trouble?" Harris shifted uneasily. "She said she needed it to cover something, some personal debt. She never told me what it was, but she sounded desperate. I didn't ask questions. I just sent the money. I didn't want to get involved." Rachel felt a chill run through her. Evelyn had been involved in something more than just an affair. There was something dark happening behind the scenes, and Victor Harris seemed to be the missing link. But what was Evelyn really hiding, and why had she involved Harris? "I need you to tell me everything, Mr. Harris," Rachel said, her tone becoming more forceful. "Why did she ask for the money? What was she afraid of?" Harris hesitated, looking over at the officers in the room. Finally, his eyes fell to the floor. She told me she was being blackmailed. Someone had pictures of her. They were threatening to ruin her life if she didn't pay them. I think it was about her affair with Thomas Walker. She was afraid that if the pictures got out, it would destroy everything." Rachel's heart raced. This was a new twist. Blackmail. It made sense now. The affair, the secret, the money, it was all coming together. Evelyn had been trying to protect herself, and in doing so, she had made dangerous decisions. The blackmail threat had pushed her to cover up her affair with Deacon Walker and perhaps other aspects of her life. Victor Harris continued, his voice growing quieter. "She begged me not to tell anyone, not even her husband. She said it would destroy him, and she couldn't bear that. She said she would handle it herself. I didn't ask who was blackmailing her. She was scared, and I didn't want to make things worse." Rachel's mind was spinning. This was the first real lead in the case. Evelyn had been hiding something far more serious than a simple affair. Someone had been blackmailing her, and the consequences of that blackmail had led to her death. "Who did she think was behind the blackmail?" Rachel pressed. Victor's face paled. I, I don't know. She didn't say. But she was terrified, Detective. I could see it in her eyes. She begged me to help, and I didn't even question it. I just gave her the money. But I swear, I didn't know this would happen. Rachel's mind was racing. Someone was blackmailing Evelyn, someone with enough leverage to push her into a corner. The affair had been part of it, but it wasn't the whole story. Rachel knew she had to dig deeper. Back in Oakwood, Rachel immediately began to connect the dots. The blackmail, the money, the affair, all of it pointed to someone who wanted to keep secrets buried. Evelyn had been trying to protect herself, but in the end, the pressure had built up to a breaking point. Her decision to get involved with Deacon Walker had led to the affair, the disease, and eventually to her death. But who was behind the blackmail? And why did it all have to end in murder? As Rachel continued her investigation, she knew that she was just beginning to uncover the true extent of the dark web of secrets that had consumed Oakwood. Detective Rachel Hayes couldn't shake the weight of the revelations she had uncovered. Evelyn Bennett's murder, the affair, the HIV diagnosis. These were all pieces of the puzzle, but something about the case still felt incomplete. Victor Harris had confessed to sending the money, but Evelyn's blackmailer remained a shadow, an unseen hand that had pushed her to live a life filled with deceit and fear. That person, the one pulling the strings, was still out there, and Rachel had to find them before anyone else was hurt. The information Rachel had gathered from Victor Harris felt like a key to the puzzle, but it was still only one piece. She needed to understand more about who would want to blackmail Evelyn and why they would resort to such drastic measures. Rachel knew she had to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Someone had been watching Evelyn closely, manipulating her with the threat of exposure. But who? The more she thought about it, the more it became clear that the key to the blackmail could be tied to someone who had been close to Evelyn, a person who had access to her life, her secrets. Could it be someone from the church? Was there someone who had been watching Evelyn's every move? A new lead came to Rachel's mind, one that she had almost overlooked in the frenzy of the past few days. Reverend Harold Bennett. Rachel had avoided speaking directly to Reverend Bennett since the murder, giving him space to grieve. But now, after everything that had come to light, she couldn't ignore the fact that he might have been connected to the blackmail in ways she hadn't yet considered. Could Reverend Bennett have known about the affair? Was he involved in some way? Rachel felt a chill down her spine as she considered the possibility that his grief might be masking something darker. The next morning, she made her way to the church. As she walked through the doors of the old building, the familiar scent of polished wood and incense filled her senses. But it felt different now, heavier. She had walked in and out of this church countless times in the past, but today it felt like she was stepping into a place that hid dark secrets. Reverend Bennett was sitting in his office, staring at the walls with hollow eyes as if he were lost in a trance. He hadn't slept much since his wife's death, and it was evident in the way he slumped in his chair, his eyes sunken and his movements sluggish. "Reverend Bennett," Rachel said, her voice steady as she entered. "We need to talk." He looked up slowly, his face betraying a flicker of surprise before it settled back into a mask of grief. "Detective Hayes," he said quietly, "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can answer any more questions." Rachel's heart softened for a moment. She knew that Harold Bennett had been devastated by the loss of his wife. Their marriage, from all appearances, had been strong, respected in the community. But everything was falling apart now. The foundation of his life was crumbling, and the truth, however painful, was waiting to be uncovered. "I understand," Rachel replied, taking a seat across from him. "I know this has been hard, but I need to ask you about something. It's important." Bennett hesitated but nodded. "What is it?" "I need to know what you knew about your wife's affairs," Rachel asked, watching him closely for any sign of deception. At first, he didn't say anything. His gaze dropped to the desk in front of him, his fingers nervously tapping the surface. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he looked up at her, his voice cracking. "Evelyn, she wasn't perfect," he said, his words halting. "I knew something wasn't right. There were times I felt like she was slipping away from me, but I couldn't face it." I loved her, detective. I still love her. But I didn't know about the affair. Not until, not until the day she was killed. Rachel studied him carefully. His words didn't come across as forced. They were raw, full of the pain of a man betrayed. But something didn't sit right with her. Was it possible he didn't know about the affair? After all, people had a way of hiding secrets, even in the closest of relationships. Reverend Bennett, Rachel continued, her tone gentle yet firm, I have reason to believe Evelyn was being blackmailed. She was trying to keep something hidden, something to do with her past. Could you have been the one she was protecting? Bennett's eyes widened, and for the first time in the conversation, he stood up, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the desk. Blackmailed? He repeated, the word foreign and painful to his ears. What are you saying? My wife was being blackmailed? Rachel nodded slowly. She was keeping secrets. She was afraid of what would happen if those secrets came to light. And I'm asking you if you knew anything about it. Could there have been someone she was afraid of? Bennett looked lost, like a man in a waking nightmare. No, no. I didn't know anything. I don't know who could have done such a thing, but she was hiding something, detective. I knew she was hiding something. She was distant, but I never imagined it was something this terrible. Rachel leaned forward. What do you mean, distant? He looked away as though fighting back tears. She changed over the past year. She started pulling away from me. She would go to the church more, spend time with the women's group. I didn't know what to make of it. I thought maybe she was just busy with the community work, trying to keep up with everything. But she became colder, more distant. I thought it was my fault, but I didn't know there was someone else. Rachel processed his words. Reverend Bennett was a broken man, a man trying to hold on to his faith while the world around him crumbled. But the fact that Evelyn had become more secretive in recent months added another layer to the mystery. Was she trying to protect him from the affair? From the blackmail? Or was there something more? I'm sorry for your loss, Reverend, Rachel said, her voice softening. But I need you to think carefully. Was there anyone who might have had a motive to hurt Evelyn? Someone who might have had the power to blackmail her? For a moment, Bennett was silent, lost in thought. His eyes darted around the room as if trying to pull together memories he had long buried. And then finally he spoke. There's one person, he said, his voice quiet, almost fearful. Someone who knew things about Evelyn's past. Someone who had been in her life before I ever met her. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. Who? Bennett swallowed hard. Her ex-husband. Rachel's mind raced. Evelyn had been married before? She had assumed, based on everything she had gathered, that Evelyn and Harold Bennett had been each other's first and only loves. But now this new piece of the puzzle, her ex-husband, was adding another layer of complexity to the case. Bennett's face was pale, his hands shaking as he continued. Her ex-husband, Robert, he left her years ago after some legal trouble. I don't know much about him, but Evelyn never talked about him. She never wanted to. She would get upset whenever I asked. Rachel's stomach churned. The secrets were starting to pile up. A new lead, someone connected to Evelyn's past, might be the key to solving the mystery. But who was Robert, and what did he have to do with the blackmail, or worse, the murder? Detective Rachel Hayes left Reverend Harold Bennett's office with a heavy heart. The mention of Evelyn's ex-husband, Robert, had thrown the case into an entirely new direction. Evelyn had been hiding more than just an affair. She had been hiding an entire chapter of her past. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fit together, but there was still one crucial question lingering in Rachel's mind. Who was Robert, and how did he tie into the blackmail and murder? As she sat in her car, reviewing the notes she had gathered, Rachel couldn't help but feel the pressure mounting. The town of Oakwood was depending on her to uncover the truth, and with each passing day, the stakes seemed higher. She needed to track down Robert and find out what role he had played in Evelyn's life, and in her death. The first thing Rachel did when she returned to the station was ask Officer Jameson to look into Robert's whereabouts. She had no idea what to expect, but she knew that finding him was the next step in solving the case. The Reverend's vague mention of Robert, combined with the fact that Evelyn had been keeping secrets about him, was too important to ignore. Rachel knew that Evelyn's past, now revealed, was just as dangerous as the present. Jameson didn't take long to pull up a record on Robert Harris, Evelyn's ex-husband. Robert had a criminal history, a history that matched the very profile of a man who could resort to blackmail. He had served time in prison for armed robbery in his younger years, but that wasn't what caught Rachel's attention. Robert Harris had been involved in a number of violent incidents since his release, and there were reports of him harassing women he had been involved with, including some prior to his marriage with Evelyn. His temper was notoriously uncontrollable, and he had a history of stalking. Rachel's instincts screamed that Robert Harris was the key to everything. The timeline, the threats, the blackmail, it all pointed to him. By the time Rachel received the address for Robert Harris, it was late in the evening. She knew she needed to act quickly, before he could vanish again or destroy any remaining evidence. With Officer Jameson and a small team, Rachel set out for the address, which was located on the outskirts of Oakwood, in a rundown neighborhood that seemed far removed from the peaceful town they all knew. The house they arrived at was a small, dilapidated bungalow. The windows were boarded up, and the yard was overgrown with weeds, making it clear that Robert hadn't been keeping up appearances for years. They knocked at the door. No response. Rachel's team went around to the back of the house, and to their surprise found the door unlocked. They entered cautiously, weapons drawn, as Rachel signaled for Jameson to follow her. The interior of the house was eerily quiet, with the same air of neglect that had surrounded the yard. Dust hung in the air, and the stale scent of old food lingered in the kitchen. "Robert Harris," Rachel called out as they moved through the house. "This is Detective Hayes. We need to speak with you." There was no response. Rachel's heart began to race. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap, but they had no choice but to continue. They moved toward the back of the house, to a door that led into a small bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and Rachel peered inside. The room was dark, with only a small lamp casting a dim glow over the bed. And there, lying face down on the floor, was Robert Harris. His body was cold, stiff. He had been dead for hours. Rachel's pulse quickened as she knelt beside him, her mind racing. This wasn't what she had expected. Robert was supposed to be the key to the case, not another victim. But as she looked closer, she saw the telltale signs of a struggle. Overturned furniture, signs that someone had forcibly entered the room. The cause of death wasn't immediately clear, but it was obvious that he hadn't died peacefully. Rachel stood up, her mind trying to piece together the events. "Call it in," she ordered Jameson. "We need to investigate this scene. It looks like we've got another murder." Back at the station, Rachel sifted through the evidence. Robert Harris' body had been taken to the coroner's office, and preliminary results indicated that he had died from a blunt force trauma to the head. The manner of his death was consistent with the violent history he had. A final, brutal end to a man who had spent his life using others to fuel his own dark impulses. But the timing of Robert's death raised an important question. Why had he been killed? Who had the motive to silence him now, when he was finally emerging as the key player in the case? As Rachel pondered the situation, the answer became increasingly clear. She thought back to the moment when Reverend Bennett had mentioned his wife's ex-husband. Could it be that Evelyn had been protecting him? Had Robert somehow been blackmailing Evelyn, threatening to reveal the affair or even her HIV status? It was clear that Robert had been involved in the blackmail, but the question remained, had someone else decided to take matters into their own hands and end the threat he posed once and for all? Rachel revisited everything she knew about the people closest to Evelyn. Deacon Thomas Walker, Reverend Bennett, and now Robert Harris. Evelyn had been caught in the middle of a toxic web of betrayal and lies, with multiple people having both the means and the opportunity to harm her. But there was one person who stood out from the rest, Deacon Thomas Walker. Rachel had learned that Walker's depression and anger had been exacerbated by his diagnosis of HIV. When he had found out that Evelyn was hiding her status from him, the betrayal had sent him into a spiral of rage. But what if he had discovered that Evelyn's ex-husband Robert was part of the problem? What if, in his volatile state, Thomas had acted out of sheer desperation to protect himself? Everything fit together in an ugly, twisted way. Evelyn had been trying to protect herself and her family from the wrath of Robert Harris. But when she had failed to pay him off, he had pushed harder. And when Deacon Walker had discovered what was really going on, he had snapped. Rachel's gut told her that Walker had killed Robert. He had found Robert in the house, and in a fit of rage, he had taken the opportunity to silence him before he could do any more damage. But Robert's death had caused a ripple effect, leading to Evelyn's own death on the altar. Walker had been consumed by guilt, but it was too late to undo what he had done. The next morning, Rachel and Jameson confronted Deacon Walker in the church. His hands were trembling as he sat in the same pew where he had witnessed Evelyn's death, the same place where he had fired the shot. "Thomas, we know what happened," Rachel said, her voice firm but compassionate. "We know about your affair with Evelyn, and we know about the blackmail. But there's one thing we need to understand. Why did you kill Robert Harris?" Walker's eyes filled with tears. He shook his head. "I didn't mean to. I was just so angry. She lied to me. She lied about everything. I couldn't take it anymore. I found him. Robert. He was going to destroy everything. And I couldn't let that happen. I had to stop him." Rachel watched him break down, his shoulders heaving as he sobbed. "I didn't mean to kill him. I didn't, but I did. And when I did, it felt like I had to keep going. It all became so real, so impossible to undo. I wanted to protect her, but I ended up killing her." The case was closed, but Oakwood would never be the same. Evelyn Bennett's secrets had been her undoing, and in the end, it was the weight of those lies that led to her tragic death. Deacon Thomas Walker had been consumed by guilt, but it didn't change the fact that he had taken 2 lives. And as for Reverend Harold Bennett, his world had been shattered beyond repair. He had lost his wife, his faith, and the life he had known. Oakwood would never forget the tragedy that had unfolded within its quiet streets. The scars of betrayal, deceit, and murder would linger in the hearts of its people forever.